red blood cells, also called erythrocytes, are some of the most common cells you find in the body. They're all theoretically contained within the cardiovascular circulatory system. The only time they're going to get out of your arteries and veins is if you happen to break an artery or a vein. The red blood cell's key function is in gas transport to all of the cells of the body and away from all of the cells of the body. They have a really unique, funky, biconcave disc shape. It's a really cool shape where it's almost like a frisbee, where they're thin in the middle and then they have a wider ridge on the outside. This really allows for a great surface to volume ratio so that gas exchange can happen really readily and easily. The cells are not as complex as many cells in the body. The great majority of the protein that's found in those cells are hemoglobin. The hemoglobin protein is a protein that's made of 4 different polypeptide chains that interact together to make one quaternary structure. Each of those chains has a heme group, and in the middle of that heme group is an iron molecule, and that iron is required to bind the oxygen. Each one of the 4 polypeptide chains can bind an oxygen, so a hemoglobin molecule is capable of binding 4 oxygens and carrying them through the blood. The process of making blood cells is called hematopoiesis, and specifically if you're making red blood cells, it's called erythropoiesis. The same hemocytoblast stem cells are capable of making all of the white blood cells, as well as platelets and erythrocytes. So one parent cell can make any of those type of cells. How it determines which cell is made is what hormone is present. And the hormone that's important in making red blood cells is called erythropoietin, or sometimes shortened to EPO. So when stimulated, these hemocytoblasts make the erythrocytes. On average, you're making 2.5 million red blood cells per second. That is a heck of a lot. So a particular hemocytoblast stem cell is triggered to differentiate, and it takes about 4 days in the bone marrow to make the cell called a reticulocyte. This reticulocyte is the cell that's released from the bone marrow where the differentiation has taken place into the circulatory system. Once it's released into the circulatory system, it takes another 2 days until it's a mature red blood cell capable of really transporting oxygen. You can actually measure how much erythropoiesis is taking place by counting reticulocytes. And if the reticulocyte count is fairly high, you know that maybe that person was bleeding or something stimulated the making of more red blood cells. This development process of the erythrocytes includes the cells actually start out fairly large and shrink down much smaller in size. Part of that shrinkage in size is actually getting rid of the nucleus and many of the intracellular functions, membranes, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi. A mature red blood cell doesn't have any of those things. It pretty much has synthesized a whole lot of hemoglobin, and it carries that hemoglobin to do its job. The homeostasis of red blood cells is very interesting. It's sort of a classic negative feedback control. Anytime you have a drop in red blood cells, the kidneys will actually have some hypoxia or not enough red blood cells to carry oxygen to the kidney, triggers the production of the erythropoietin hormone, which will stimulate hemocytoblasts in the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. Any time that you're in an environment where there's a low oxygen, atmospheric oxygen, you can stimulate erythropoiesis. This is one of the reasons why athletes train at high altitudes, is so that they'll have more red blood cells and more oxygen carrying capacity. Anytime you're doing aerobic exercises for long periods of time, the demand for oxygen in the skeletal muscles goes up and you'll increase your erythropoiesis. And anytime you're bleeding, your red blood cell count will go low and it will stimulate erythropoiesis. That heme molecule in the hemoglobin requires oxygen, and one of the key issues that people face is that we're constantly losing iron, and getting iron is actually a little bit tricky. Our bodies don't absorb iron very well, so it really takes quite a bit of consumption of iron to get the amount of iron we need. In addition, your stomach has to be acidic enough to convert the iron to a form that is able to be absorbed. And people who are taking a lot of antacids or have trouble with stomach acid production could in fact not have enough acidity to be able to absorb the iron that they need. Also, iron is interesting in that it requires transport proteins wherever it is. It's not able to just be soluble in water and get delivered to wherever it needs to be. There are specific proteins, and there are multiple different ones that are required at different points to get iron to where it needs to go. Red blood cells, because they don't have a nucleus, they don't have endoplasmic reticulum or Golgi, if proteins get old and slightly damaged, they're not able to repair them. So red blood cells live shorter than many cells in the body, only about 120 days. After a while, their membranes get kind of fragile, and as they pass through really, really small capillaries in the spleen, they'll like squeeze their membrane to try to fit through the small membrane, and then they're not able to get back to their regular biconcave disc shape. When that happens, there are macrophages in the spleen that just phagocytize the red blood cell and recycle it. The red blood cell is recycled in specific ways. The membranes and the globin, amino acid parts of the red blood cell, are just taken into a lysosome of the macrophage and recycled so that the amino acids can be used and the fats can be used again. But the heme group and the iron are recycled for use, and you can see that the liver will actually break up the heme from the globin, and the heme itself, the iron is mostly recycled, and then the heme part actually becomes a molecule called bilirubin that's part of bile. Bile is released from the liver during digestion of fats, and it's part of how fats get absorbed into the body. But some of that bile can actually be released in the feces as well, so it can be lost in that way.